This is lecture 2A for Wednesday, September 2nd for History 111. This lecture is going to be broken up into 3 parts. So there'll be a lecture 2A, B, and C. And the discussion, there will also be discussion, but it'll be shorter than the last one. Overall, I should mention that on these lectures, I'm trying to keep the overall time for the lecture and the discussion videos to less than an hour and 50 minutes a time, because that's the class time that we would normally have. So, so overall, I try to, if the lectures go a little longer, the discussion will be a little shorter. If the discussion's going to be a little longer, I'll make the lectures shorter. So today I want to talk about 3 things. I'm going to talk about ancient Mesopotamia, which is the first real civilization in world history. Then I'm going to talk about ancient Egypt, which is very close to Mesopotamia. And then I'm going to talk about the Hebrews just a little bit. And then next time we'll talk about Harappan civilization in India. We'll get into China and those sorts of things. So let me start with ancient Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia is in modern-day Iraq. And essentially this area is defined by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they run roughly parallel from the mountains in southeastern Turkey down to the Persian Gulf and in the Indian Ocean. And they are, this is the birth of agriculture, right? This is the first place that we know agriculture happened. And the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are the major source of water running through this area. Today, the area has a lot of desert, and I'll talk about why that was different back in the time we're talking about. But the Tigris and Euphrates would both flood quite a bit, especially at certain times of the year when crops were actually ripening. So initially, farmers just worked around this and tried to find places where they didn't flood and that there was enough moisture year-round to grow their crops. But very quickly, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the people living there decided that the best way to handle this was actually to start to use irrigation. And what they basically did is they began to create enormous basins that would fill up with floodwaters. And this had 2 effects. One is that they would control the floodwater so they wouldn't flood all their fields and kill all the plants. And second, they would then capture that water so that they could use it to water their fields with a series of irrigation canals and ditches over the course of the months after the flooding. And so this really allowed them to manage the water supply and to make the Mesopotamian region much more productive. Right? Now, the earliest civilizations in the Mesopotamian region, in fact, the earliest civilizations in human history, were a series of cities that emerged in southern Mesopotamia, way down in today would be southern Iraq, near the Persian Gulf. And there were several cities that emerged: Uruk, Lagash, Babylon, Nippur, Eridu, and Kish. I don't have up there, but these cities were all fairly close. They were just a few miles from each other. But the region was producing enough food that they actually had fairly dense populations, and these cities grew up. And they were really not very far apart, and the land was really flat, so you could see one city from another city, etc. And each city was essentially a little city-state. The city had a government that protected the region around the city and the farmland. The farmland fed the people in the city as well as the farmers living in the farms outside of the city. And so this is the first civilization, is that agriculture had created population densities enough and had produced enough food surpluses that you could actually feed a population who lived in the cities who wasn't farming, right? And that was a big jump, because essentially in a hunting and gathering society, everybody has to be gathering food all for themselves, and basically they need everybody to be gathering food. In an agricultural society, you can produce enough surplus that you can have people who don't actually produce food or go gather food. And so this allows you to produce cities and social classes. And I'll talk more about that in the discussion. Okay, so within Mesopotamian civilization, then you had the first governments also, right? The first the first kings, the first armies, the first tax collectors, and all of that. And this creates social classes. And if you look at ancient Mesopotamian society, and we don't have a heck of a lot of detail, but we have a fairly large number of writings. And I want to point out, this is the civilization that produced the Epic of Gilgamesh that you guys are reading, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the earliest, is the earliest work of literature that we have. It was written on stone tablets in ancient Mesopotamia. In fact, it's roughly 2500 BCE is when we think it was first written. We have tablets of it for centuries after that. So we know from things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as other stone tablets, that a bit about Mesopotamian civilization. And the first is that there were a number of social classes, and the social classes were fairly rigid. And so at the top were the nobles who owned large amounts of land. And there were basically two types of nobles. There were the nobles who were the sort of political class, the kings and the military leaders who owned a significant chunk of land and lived off the produce of that land, but also taxes on everybody else. But there was another group who were priests, and they were the official sort of priest class, and they also owned a lot of land. Usually it was owned by the temple rather than the priests themselves. But the priests controlled the land and the wealth that came from that land, and so the priests basically functioned as another noble class, and the military men and the priests and the kings all together formed this sort of ruling class who owned the vast majority of the land and were much wealthier than anybody else in the society. Then below that you had free commoners, who were people who owned some land. They didn't own enough to be wealthy, they weren't elites, and they didn't have any power necessarily. They were more like small farmers, but they were free because they owned their own land. Right? And then there was another group called clients, and these were people who did not own land, and they were therefore dependent on the elites for positions, for trade, etc. And these were the people who lived in the cities as servants, as artisans, etc., things like that. They were free, technically, because they weren't slaves, but they were always sort of attached to a wealthy and powerful patron, and so they really were not free in the sense of being able to decide what to do with their own lives, etc. They served the noble classes, and then finally there was a class of slaves who were exactly what you would think. They were slaves. In addition, Mesopotamian society had a patriarchy, which meant that land ownership was basically through men, and was passed down generation by generation through men. Men held the major political positions. Men were the priests, although it's possible there were some female priests. But even within the law, we're aware that men had legal control of their wives and children, and that women were circumscribed in a whole bunch of ways. So the patriarchy means that the system of the government and the laws and the society was set up to give men political and other kinds of power, economic power within society, and to make women dependent on men. Right? So that's the society, and the law in the society was pretty harsh. I'll talk about Hammurabi in a minute. Hammurabi was an emperor in the old Babylonian Empire. He was known for leaving us Hammurabi's Code, which is one of the first legal codes ever written. And essentially what Hammurabi's Code is a whole bunch of, if this punishment happens here, or if this crime happens, here's this punishment. And it's the basic philosophy of it is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So if it comes up that somebody put out somebody else's eye in a fight, well, they're going to have their eye put out, right? That's the punishment. And so the general idea was, if you stole 50, shekels or whatever the unit of currency was, actually it wasn't, they didn't have a unit of currency, but if you stole 2 sheep, you had to pay back 2 sheep, right? And so this could be pretty harsh, because for instance, if a builder builds a house and it falls down and kills somebody's wife, then the builder's wife gets killed, right? That's pretty harsh. So the society was fairly rigid. It was not likely that anybody could move from one social class to another. You were born into a class, you were going to be in that class. There's a great deal of slavery and clientage, and the laws are fairly harsh. And the religion reflected this. Right? ancient Mesopotamian society had a religion, and we're going to see that there's a lot of religions we're going to talk about in this course. And there's one class of religions that I call a transactional religion, which is that basically the idea is that there's a bunch of gods who control the universe, but they don't really care about human beings, right? And so human beings, if they want the gods to do something to protect them, have to offer the gods something. And so in this what I would call a transactional religion, what happens is that if there's a drought, if the gods have brought a drought that's killing people, the priests will do offerings to the gods, which are things they think the gods want, and in return the gods will agree to end the drought. And so the religion is basically, it's not a religion the way we understand a religion, like you have a personal relationship with the gods, or you have a code of morality you're supposed to live up to. The religion is just a series of transactions between the gods and human beings. Human beings offer the gods this much offering. The gods return you give them something back, either by bringing rain or ending a plague or bringing them victory in battle, whatever they're asking the gods for. Right? So the religion, first of all, is transactional. It's just a series of transactions with no assumption of a long-term relationship involved in that. And then second, there is it's carried out by priests. There's no expectation that individual people will be doing anything in relation to the religion. It's instead, the religion is a bunch of priests in the priestly class deal with the gods on behalf of the whole society, the whole civilization, right? And so this religion doesn't place a heavy emphasis on morality. It doesn't place a heavy emphasis on people should live their lives this way. It's merely about getting the gods to take care of society through plentiful harvests and an end to diseases and things like that. The religion is they have multiple deities. They have gods and goddesses for the air and for fire and for the fertility and the harvest and etc. And so they have multiple deities, and each they pray to the proper deity. If they need this or that, if they need a good harvest, they pray to the goddess of the harvest, etc. And we'll see. This is the religion behind the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so we'll see, one of the things that you should pay attention to in the Epic of Gilgamesh is how are the gods depicted? What are the gods like, right? And not to spoil it, but they're basically sociopathic. Okay, they don't care what damage they cause. They want to do what they want to do, right? Now, one of the other aspects of the religion is that the gods did control things. They had enormous powers. They had superpowers. So they could control human lives and change human lives. And because the gods don't really care about human beings, one aspect of the religion is the priests are constantly trying to figure out, to get signs of what the gods are thinking and planning and doing. And so the priests are trying to constantly do what we would call magic, to sort of see the future or predict the outcome of a battle or something like that. All right. So that's sort of the crux of Mesopotamian society, and I'm going to talk in the discussion for today about cities and how they functioned more generally beyond Mesopotamia, but that's the gist of it for now. Last thing I want to talk about is there were a series of empires that emerged in Mesopotamia, and gradually what happens over time is that the empires move north up through Mesopotamia. So they begin, the first empire is in ancient Sumeria is down, the Akkadian Empire is down right on the Persian Gulf, but then the old Babylonian Empire and then the Assyrian Empire are gradually farther and farther north in what we would today call Iraq, and that's partly due to environmental issues, which I'll talk about in a later discussion. But for now, the first real empire that we're aware of in world history was founded by Sargon of Akkad. He was he basically staged a military coup in the city of Kish, and then using Kish, he conquered other cities in the neighborhood, and Uruk and Lagash and etc. And he used, and by basically conquering these other cities, he was able to use their resources and manpower then to build a bigger army that allowed him to conquer other cities. Right? And so his empire was founded in 2331 BCE, and it lasted until 2100 BCE. And part of its collapse was, again, due to environmental issues, which I'll talk about later. The Old Babylonian Empire was founded in 1894 BCE. And the most famous emperor, he's not the founder, but the most famous emperor of it was Hammurabi. Again, Babylon is farther up. It's in the middle of modern-day Iraq. Whereas the Akkadian Empire was in southern Iraq. And then finally later, we see by 1300 BCE, the Assyrian Empire, which is headquartered at Nineveh, is in northern Iraq. And that would be succeeded again by the New Babylonian Empire, which I'll talk about when we get to the Hebrews, etc. But the New Babylonian Empire was founded by Nebuchadnezzar in the 600s BCE. So essentially, ancient Mesopotamia is sort of the prototype for civilizations at this time. You see the emergence of agriculture, especially irrigation agriculture. I'll talk about that with the Wittfogel thesis later in a discussion. And at first you just get a city that emerges. Once you've got irrigation agriculture, it's enough productivity that you start getting surplus population, and you start to see people create cities, and then you get social classes and land ownership and things like that. You get governments, you get armies, and then you get organized religion. But these early religions are what I call transactional, right? You just simply ask the gods for something, and the gods give it to you if you offer them the right deal. And there's no expectation the gods will care about you after that. They just care about each transaction. And then ancient Mesopotamia saw the creation of several empires in a row. And we'll talk more about other empires in future lectures. But that's basically it for ancient Mesopotamia.